Good evening. I'm Alexander Rose, the Executive Director at the Long Now Foundation. As many of you know, we start these talks with a long short, a short film that in some way exemplifies long-term thinking, and often we cheat and use things like time lapses. Tonight's is a little different, but before I introduce that, I just wanted to mention there is a whole other series now going on that Long Now is producing at our smaller venue, The Interval. This Friday, we have a 5 p.m. kind of a social hour talk with Rachel Sussman, who formerly spoke in this series on her project photographing organisms that have lived longer than 2,000 years all over the world. And her book is just now coming out, and we'll be hearing another talk from her, as well as she'll be doing a book signing. That's Friday in Fort Mason, and afterwards you can go to get your dinner at Off the Grid from all the trucks. And Tuesday we have Violet Blue speaking about her newest book, Smart Girl's Guide to Privacy. And she has all kinds of good tips for how to not let your digital data go out into the world. So tonight's long short is actually by someone who has, I believe, agreed to give a talk in the series when he walks by in about 5 years. And he started his walk out of Africa a little over a year ago. This is a description of his project from right before he left. He emailed us from Israel, where he is now, and gave us permission for this video, and they are actually soliciting support for their effort. And there's a URL at the end to help get them through him through walking the entire Out of Africa track down through the Americas over the course of 7 years. Enjoy.
Next year, I'm taking a long walk, retracing our ancestors' first great migration across the planet, starting in our birthplace, the Rift Valley of East Africa, and walking north through the Levant and then eastward across the gravel plains of Asia to Arctic Siberia, from where I'll hop a boat to the Americas and ramble down the western flank to Patagonia, the last corner of the world where our ancestors ran out of horizon. I'm a journalist, and I'm trying really hard to return to a more human pace of storytelling, not just jetting in and out of assignments, but walking with people, digging deep into crucial stories that we miss because we're all moving too fast to listen. I'm as worried as anyone about the troubles we face in the century ahead. Climate change, resource shortages, mass migrations, war. But our ancestors also overcame huge obstacles in their primal journey across the world, whether it was ice ages or massive epidemics or famines. My long journey will be difficult, and I'm not so naive to believe that the world can't kill you in an instant. It can. But in my experience, when you slow down, people tend to open up to you. The world, it's home, after all.
Good evening. I'm Stuart Brand from the Long Now Foundation. The Long Now Foundation adores deserts. I think it's because the Long Now adores deserts. Because when you go into the desert, you step out of cultural time, you step out of biological time, and you step into geological time. And things in deserts, because the water isn't there anymore, are incredibly well preserved. Partly because there's no water to rot them and various kinds of traffic to wear them down. Partly because humans don't go there anymore, because the water's not there. If you want the long view of the long horizon, the desert has large quantities of that, except during tough storms. Our speaker tonight has been dealing with the best of all of Earth's deserts, the Sahara. Which is bigger than anything. You look at Earth from space, and big events are Antarctica, the oceans, and the big, brown, amazing event of North Africa. So everything south of the Mediterranean all the way down to Central Africa is just one single, enormous, unexplored, uninhabited event that has been an event at various times in human history and is again in various respects. And when our speaker looks at things out there, when the very few explorers go there and look at things out there, they're often looking at things that nobody's looked at or thought about in thousands of years. That's what geological time is like, to experience, to examine, and to dissect and analyze and then think about. And who's at the best at that is our speaker, Stefan Kröpelin.
Thank you, Stuart. Hello, everyone. Does the sound work? Yes. Okay, thank you, because this fell out of my pocket. So I'm going to talk tonight on my favorite subject, the Sahara, and particularly on the mysterious desert cradle hidden in the deep Sahara. The Sahara, as Stuart just mentioned, is the largest hot desert on Earth. It covers almost about the size of the United States, 9 million square kilometers. So one lifetime is not good enough to know at least a part of it. And of course, the Sahara doesn't exist. There's many Saharas. It's like a big difference between the Canadian border and Florida and the East Coast states and California. And the same applies to the Sahara, of course. So I'm focusing on the Eastern Sahara, which to the present day probably is the least explored part of this big desert. And even in 100 years ago, it was practically completely unexplored, as you see on this atlas from 1922. And so it's a big opportunity for geologists and geoarchaeologists like mine of really going still these days on research frontiers. And that's part of the sites I've been working during the past 35 years. So each red spot can stay for a few days, but it can also stand for a few months of field work. And this was only possible within the scope of several large-scale, long-term research projects called collaborative research centers, which provided the logistics and the possibilities to work in these remote places. This is an outline of what I'm going to talk. So first I will talk a bit on the working conditions, which are a bit different from geological work in some other places on the globe. And then I will provide you a few examples of outstanding sites, but it's just a very short selection of sites I could show you if there would be more than an hour. And finally, I will try to condense everything into a short synthesis and conclusion on the origin. So going to your study area sometimes take weeks and months, and there's no tracks because the Eastern Sahara is practically devoid of wells and near-surface groundwater. There's no Bedouins as in the central or western part of the Sahara. That means there are practically no tracks, and you always have to find your own way. And especially during the pre-GPS period, that was sometimes a bit complicated. You have to carry everything you can. And for example, this few Kababish Bedouins were the only people we met during the first 10 years of fieldwork in the Eastern Sahara, where the last prehistoric people left some 5,000 years ago. And most places you go, you are the first human, Homo sapiens, who returns to these sites. And sometimes you have to drive down quite steep slopes. Sometimes you have to climb up an escarpment of a couple of 100 meters, which takes sometimes a whole day just to get 2 vehicles up, building your own road using sand ladders. Sometimes you have to shovel away half a dune and prepare your own road to find a descent down an escarpment in some places. Well, that's daily sports. This is digging out your vehicles, which is particularly difficult in salty marsh deposits with near surface groundwater. Sometimes the whole fleet is sunk like here in the Great Sand Sea of Egypt, where sometimes the cars are stuck 50 times in a row. And in the evening, you know what you've done, but certainly no research these days. And even worse is if your 26-ton trunk gets sunk in some sort of muddy salt deposits, and you can go on it for some while until it breaks down, and unloading 18 tons of payload and getting 3 vehicles out of it made our day, or the last day of 1983. So sometimes you have to build your own road just to get down from plateaus into the foreland without knowing whether you will make it out again. Because sometimes if, for example, a valley gets blocked and you're down with the cars, then you have a serious problem. And sometimes it gets dusty. Most people don't like it. We like it because these are weathered paleolake deposits, so-called fesh deposits. And a second later, you wouldn't see the car anymore. Sometimes you have kind of mechanical problems, like in this case, where the back axis of our Unimog was cut, like with a laser beam, 100 kilometers away from the Nile. And what we could do is use a backhoe shovel as a force wheel and walk the last 50 miles back to the Nile Valley. Sometimes visibility is quite bad, like this a few years ago, where we had a 1-week-long dust storm, which is much more difficult than sandstorms, because sand normally doesn't fly higher than 2 meters above ground. So on a camel on top of the car, you're easy, while driving for a week with such visibility of just a few yards poses some problems, especially if you have to cross dune fields. The biggest problem in the past few years, since our paradise of fools, where we stayed up to 6 months in a row in 1 year without meeting a single person, today is, of course, insecurity. And normally you only find out very last minute that this, for example, is a detachment, official detachment of the Chadian army and not rebels. If this would have been rebels or bandits, I might not be here for this lecture today. And even worse are the landmines, which are widely distributed in the access zones to our study areas in the central Sahara, usually bad remains from the Libyan war with Chad, for example, where you're not supposed to leave one track. And me going in front, that's one of the rare occasions where all my colleagues are really following in my track directly, which is also normally not often the case. If you're unlucky, then you hit an anti-tank mine. To cut a long story short, the 2 passengers were not hurt with a miracle, but a few minutes later, nothing of this brand new Mercedes car were just some liquid aluminium. And going there, of course, you have to find a campsite every night, because usually geologists are Bedouin, so we normally we get our work quickly done, so preferred campsites are in the downwind side of this large volcanic dunes, which can weigh up to hundreds of thousands tons, which are transported by the wind a couple of meters, up to 8 meters a year, so still not well understood physical features. And of course, everybody knows it's quite hot in the Sahara, sometimes plus more than 50 degrees in the shade. And of course, there is little shade, so if you forget to take your foot underneath the car, then you got a heavily sunburn within minutes. On the other hand, much worse are the cold nights, with including the chill factor, which can cool down in the winter season, and that's the only time of the year when you can work to a felt minus 20 degrees Celsius. I don't know that exactly in Fahrenheit, but believe me, it's cold. And that's our kitchen. If there's some sandstone and you forget to close our kitchen, then there's a room for some cleaning up the next day. So enough with takes up a high percentage of our work in the Sahara. So when I was young, I thought, well, one day preparation is needed for 1 hour of serious field work. Sometimes in between, I got that 1 week is necessary, from writing proposals down to getting the permits and customs and transport and so on, for 1 hour. But anyway, there's a very low relation between the work you have to put on logistics just to get to these remote areas. Our field methods, I'm not talking about lab methods, this would be another lecture, but and we are studying more than 50 different proxies, as we say, to find out paleoclimate. But the most, our favorite time is digging holes, either using such small mechanical excavators like this one, and then digging a few yard deep holes where you can take the samples and look for archaeological remains, etc., which is much better than taking cores. And if not possible, then just digging a hole and go in and look what you find at the base. That's geologists. Sometimes we already dug 6-7 meter deep holes, and that was what I've seen the whole day, taking the section. There was just a hole in the top that's in the central Sahara. And other interesting, easier work is taking up stratigraphies. That means layers of deposits of former now long extinct lakes and rivers and playa lakes, and this is one of the sites. For the archaeologists, a lot of time has to be spent for surveying or for mapping any sites, and that's a large prehistoric site where at the first sight few people would think that there's anything left. Archaeological excavations are extremely time-consuming, like here in the Great Sea of Sandsea, where sometimes you need a couple of weeks just to excavate a few square meters, but every excavation means destruction and means to have to resolve this big puzzle of the kind of artifacts which have been produced at this site, and to tell who did it, what skills did he have, in which direction was the wind blowing, and so on. You have to take this time not to lose any possible information to your best of conscience. Excavating one Neolithic grave, for example, can also take 1 week for 4 to 5 archaeologists. The same applies to remains like this elephant jaw embedded in Paleo Lake deposits, which is also, it's not just taking it out and sampling it, but getting all the information possible. So now, why do all this kind of work? And the first reply is, of course, academic. It's first of all to say, well, do the ocean cores and the ice cores from the polar region tell the whole story for climate change on the continents? And that's in the end where people are living, used to be living, and will be living in the future. And as man is neither fish nor penguin, the important information has to come from terrestrial paleoclimatology. And there's many things, for example, which were that the Holocene, the post-glacial period of the past 11,000 years, was considered, based on polar research, as the most stable period. As you will see in the Sahara, the opposite was the case. Another hypothesis, which was based on an ocean core taken by my good friend Peter Dimenocal from Lemont in New York, was that he was claiming by analyzing or interpreting ocean cores that the onset of the Green Sahara happened within decades, within 1 generation, and is the same. That's what he claimed was this desiccation of the entire Sahara, of what he called the African humid period happened also in a few decades, and that was, which didn't go along with our data, which we've been collecting. And of course, the general approach is to see how climate and environmental change change the socio-economic way of life of the prehistoric dwellers in what is today a hyper-arid desert, and whether that included cultural change, and whether that already brought some evolution which is important to Africa to the present day. And so paleoclimatology is always more amazing. That's why also my friend Ray Bradley put it on the leading textbook on paleoclimatology. Once humans are in, paleoclimatology without humans is a bit less exciting. And of course, I recently stumbled on this quote from Stewart, "The urchin keeps displacing the important in our daily lives." And that made me think, why on earth, or why someone like me who goes into the desert for more than 40 years, spent there a couple of months every year, there must be some hidden motivation. If not, probably you wouldn't do it. And some people only go once and never again. And there's many things which come to my mind. I mean, first of all, you have in your campsite in the night, you have a 360-degree horizon around you, and you hear the blood in your veins. Some Bedouins say you can even listen to your bones, and you hear the meteorite. If you have some meteorite going down in the night, you hear the sound. When there's no wind, there's absolute quiet. Of course, you stop being a consumer, like in the Western world, a consuming agent, more or less, because there's nothing you could buy and so on. The same as money loses any importance, because the only thing it's good for when you stay months without meeting any people is maybe to light a fire. Of course, there's no internet. And so does your whole existence, which in one way loses any importance under this hotel of 1,000,000 stars, which you have any night when there's no sandstorm, and staying outside. So listening, thinking about these daily problems, finding a parking lot, they sound so absurd once you're in a place where you have 9 kilometers of parking lot available, and it's difficult to explain that to some of the few remaining local people there. And on the other hand, your own existence gains a lot of value, because even any single drop of water is a miracle, more or less. And even the morning, you have a sympathy when there's a slightly frozen scorpion crawling out under your sleeping bed. So you would never have the idea to kill it, because he survived, you survived another cold night or stormy night, and he's trying to do his life as you do. So there's a sort of sympathy, which may sound crazy to you, but that's really one of the of the motivations you have. And so, of course, deserts are timeless, and there we also are in the one long now subject. It's probably the state, it's the fate of the planet. Everything will become desert, like the surface of Mars and so on. So it's without time. And again, so I start with it before I get too philosophical. That's really, I think it's no wonder that most religions originated in deserts, where you're really confronted to yourself. And now I'm showing you a few examples. One comes from the Gilf Kebir, a big sandstone plateau in the southwestern corner of Egypt, south of the Great Sand Sea of Egypt, and you have this almost 1,000-mile long longitudinal views up to 100 meters high, which run into the sandstone plateau. And some may know it, who have seen the film The English Patient, which goes back to one of our tradition. The English patient, in fact, was Laszlo Almásy, to whom we still have a lot of direct relation. And of course, the film The English Patient wasn't shot there close to the Libyan border, but in Hollywood and Tunisia and some easier places. But there you have what Almásy or The English Patient called the swimmer's cave, where you have depictions of apparently swimming people in the middle of the desert, where today there's less than 2 millimeters of rainfall on an average, which forms part of the rock art in this cave. And on this radar image, you can see that it's, in fact, there were really fluvial system drainage patterns existing during the period, the first half of the Holocene, 11 to 5,000 years ago, more or less, which originated directly at the foot of this cave of the swimmers. And recently, just a few years ago, some Italian tourist explorers found another cave nearby, which is probably the single most richest single abri in all of the Sahara, where you have more than 10,000 single depictions ranging from 2 millimeters to more than 2 meters, depicting some monster-like features, and also depicting some swimming person apparently, and all kinds of other details which tell a story about the prehistoric life in this remote place when the Sahara was rather savannah than a desert. And there's even many paintings and engravings which may be connected to the much later art during the pharaonic empire. On the other hand, there's still lots of room of speculation, and we normally prefer to get some firm evidence before venturing into too much demanding hypothesis on the origin. There's a book which our Heinrich Barth Institute edited recently. It's 5 kilograms, so I couldn't bring it, but it's probably the largest rock art documentation of a single site, well, to my knowledge. So not too far away is Wadi Bakht, and usually we give our own names because there's no Bedouins you could call for local names, so we always term most of the sites ourselves. This is a playa lake, like in the southwestern states of today, which once had a quite impressive surface, water surface, which was formed because the water was blocked by a former dune, which closed the entire valley. And only some 7,000 years ago, this dune dam broke, and so through a natural gap, the water drained, and since then there was no more accumulation of deposits, which are the only basis for climate reconstruction geologists have. And that's one of the sections, and where you see that you have each and every single major rainfall event recorded in some tiny sand layers. And if you get radiocarbon dating, you get more detailed information on the distribution of secular rain events over the millennia in this hyper-arid core, present-day hyper-arid core of the Eastern Sahara, which had rainfall up to 150 millimeters per year compared to less than 2 millimeters today. And all of these deposits are connected to the change in the prehistoric life and economy. So another interesting point is, which I would just mention shortly, that it's not the average rainfall per year which is important, but rather the distribution of the paleo rainfall. That means some monsoonal summer daytime rainfall has much less impact on the growth of vegetation than have this very light winter nighttime rains, which occurred during the later period, which provided for much more grassland and much more pasture than in the earlier days. That means sometimes the data from geology and archaeology are contradictory until you resolve the puzzle. So another example is what was once the largest paleo lake in the eastern Sahara, what we called West Nubian Paleo Lake. And what you see here is not the backbone of a gazelle, but the backbone of a Nile perch, which used to live in this place where today no scorpion can survive, with a length of almost 2 yards. And some places are not covered by wind-blown sand, and with the old Landsat 1 data we had, there was practically nothing to be seen, but it used to be a very large lake with full of fauna. That means within 5 minutes you could collect such a collection of fish bones and crocodile bones and hippo bones, etc., etc. And also we found some tortoises, and these tortoises have been the last proofs that probably what we rediscovered and called it West Nubian Paleo Lake in fact corresponds with the Ptolemaic marshes of the tortoises, which are recorded in the written sources by Ptolemy, and where the geology, present-day geology, could also locate these lakes which were not known before. And this, what looks like today should have looked like present-day Chad today, a very large but very shallow freshwater lake. And of course, once there's water, there's prehistoric settlements, and what looks like this today, including cattle burials and all kinds of archaeological, with all kinds of archaeological features, probably looked like this when the early cattle were used by this by the people living around this lake. And again, very short, sometimes settlement sets on only after the maximum lake extension has gone, because who likes to settle in a marsh which is infested by crocodiles and malaria, mosquitoes and so on, that usually only once these lakes, these paleo lakes, became smaller, that people approached while the surrounding environments were no more good for living, so they were approaching these remaining lakes until they finally disappeared. So another example is one which is to the present day practically the least explored part of the Sahara, if not of Africa, and this is in the extreme northeastern corner of what is today the Republic of Chad. Only one, Hassanein Bey, tried to cross it riding in front of his caravan on a white horse, but he was guided, of course, by them guides from Kufra in the southern Libyan oasis through Jebel Uainat, and then he crossed it, but he was riding at night, so there's practically nothing left of his first transect through this area, and he would have died of thirst if the year before wouldn't have been a rainy one, exceptional rainy one, and so they found a gelter with water, and that's the way they made it into sub-Saharan Africa. So that was one trip we did in 2005 on this Erdimar, which is as unknown as the Gilf Kebir Plateau, which I've been showing before, was 120 years ago. That means there has never ever been any scientific research or even any other visitor to the written knowledge, and it's a high escarpment. These are cars for scale, where you first have to find your way up. Even there, Google doesn't help too much. Sometimes you're driving again on apparently sandy surfaces, which in fact are just a small wind-blown cover on weathered fluvial and former paleo lake deposits, and this is a dust which in the end nourishes the Amazonian rainforest, because this dust, which originates in Chad today, is transported over the Atlantic and provides all the minerals necessary for the survival of tropical rainforests. And that's typical landscape. It's like the surface on Mars, down into detail, really from millimeter scale to tens of kilometer scale. It's very similar. So this is probably the best analogon for the landforms on Mars, on planet Earth. And there are some in the northeast parts exist like this, where you could have a 360-degree view, which would look all the same. And at this specific position, 19.5 degrees north, 23 degrees east, is what used to be the triangular junction between the three empires of France, England, and Italy. And that was why this small stone cairn was erected by the only known Meharist two soldiers who were sent there to mark the border of the three European empires in 37. So we didn't find it, we found it later, but they did a very good job, even it's many kilometers away from the GPS position, of course. And I was showing this to show that there's places like the Erdemar Plateau where there is practically nothing. There are almost no prehistoric settlement site. There are no paleolake. That means this plateau must have been what it is still today, because Erdemar means the enemy's country, and this has been also depicted like that since historical writings. And even if today, if you would run into someone, and probably you could stay there for many years without meeting a single person, but if, then for sure this would be bandits or rebels. While surrounding of the Erdemar, you have still these virgin sites, which consists of these grinding tools and many, many other archaeological material. And that's for sure that not even any Bedouin has passed at this location during the past 5,000 years, because he certainly would have taken this moraka, this grinding tool, for his wife at home in his village for regular daily use. So that was my team of this first scientific exploration of this part of the world. And now I'm taking you to another part of Chad, in northeastern Chad, the Ennedi Plateau, which is a triangularly scaped sandstone plateau. It's like a big labyrinth. So 90% are completely unknown to the present day, and probably will still take a generation to explore all these thousands and thousands of miles of box canyons hidden in this plateau, the size of Switzerland, more than 30,000 square kilometers, or maybe one day Mars-type robots who will do the job. And the first mentioning of the sites was by Gustav Nachtigall, one of the early German explorers who did the basic research in Chad, but even Nachtigall, in spite his 5-year travel, didn't make it there, but he collected all the information by the local people at the time and was describing it quite well. So the surrounding escarpment looks like this. In many places, you have real labyrinths, which to me are really the origin of the tales of 1001 Night, with the labyrinth where a camel can hardly go through, and so on, and to the detail. And this is a recent drone view from a clip we prepared for UNESCO recently, where you see that you really can get lost. If there's a dust storm, GPS doesn't work because you don't have satellite access. You can really die of thirst if you lose yourself inside. So even today, you have to take care. And some places resemble very much to the Monument Valley, but they are much more distributed and much bigger. You have some of the highest rock arches on the globe. You have, for example, these mushroom rocks, which indicate the former land surface, and this is evidence of millions of sandstorms who have taken everything in the lower 2 meters away. You have all kinds of other interesting sandstone pillars, etc. And you have lots of vegetation, especially in its western valleys, because of the higher elevation, which collects some monsoonal rainfall still coming from the Gulf of Guinea and transversing a big part of sub-Saharan Africa to reach there. So that's why it has been called the Garden Eden of the Sahara, which is a sort of relict area, which is a good comparison for the situation during the Green Sahara 11,000 to 5,000 years ago. You also have some very small entrances to gorges, which sometimes open up to cathedral-like structures where you find trees and birds and water and so on. And you have the famous Gorge d'Aché, where there's still the last remaining crocodiles in all of the Sahara, the last remaining crocodiles which have survived 5,000 years of aridity, which once came from the Nile, going along the Wadi Howa to reach the Ennedi Mountains, and the last populations, now there are 7, and there's, against all the forecasts of all biologists, there's a newborn crocodile one, which got out of an egg last year, so even sometimes a minimum population is good enough for proliferance. That's the right word. So here you probably see nothing at all, but if you look closer, you find these 2 Barbary sheep, mouflons, which are still living in this place, which are extinct in most places of the Sahara. You also still find lots of other animals which are completely extinct anywhere else in the Sahara. And we met people who have never seen a white person in their life, never seen a Western or European in their life, who live in very remote places on top of the plateau. And once they got to know that we wouldn't do them any harm, they were very friendly. That happens to the present day. In the Sahara, people who have never seen any white person. And most famous of all is the rock art of the Ennedi, which in my view surpasses any other rock art sites, of which there are a few in the Sahara, including the Tassili Acher in the uncounted abris and caves there, and some which give a very clear, almost photographic impression of prehistoric life in this mountainous area during the time, and you already can see some details as it is, but once you're applying some color enhancing methods, then you see much more, and you can really find details on the dress the women had, the type of dance when they went out for a party or whatsoever, taken from into details on their hut, to how they had the hairdresses, etc. Many other details which are hidden there and which really give direct insight in this prehistoric way of life, 9,000 to 2,000 years ago, more or less. And this is all natural colors which survived uncounted hours of insolation, heavy insolation and sandstorms and so on, and they are still there. But the most important animal depicted were the cows, which apparently had a much bigger significance to prehistoric people than elephants or giraffes or hippos or rhinos and so on. And in the later period, during the Iron Age, you had typically the sort of horse rider, until the camel people arrived around 2,000 years ago, because camels were introduced into the Sahara only about 2,000 years ago after the Persian invasion of Egypt. And there you see all the first snakes coming up, and normally these camels are painted, overlay of earlier rock art, such as these horses or the cattle, and sometimes on top of these camels, which are the more recent historical period, you still find a Toyota pickup with some Kalashnikov attached on top, and this is the most recent rock art dating from the 1950s, when there was the onset of modern cars in this part of the Sahara. We might even have found the first comic, but that would be enough for another one. But depending whether you read it from left to right or vice versa, it tells a different story. And so we go to to Wadi Howa, which once was the largest tributary to the Nile from the Sahara, linking the central Chadian basin of Lake Chad with the Nile Valley in a easterly direction. So it was a large river up to 10 kilometers wide, and the lower part was 500 kilometers long, and had really a super regional importance for the southeastern Sahara. And that's how it looks today if you're lucky and you find some windows with some exposed river deposits, and you even find people who drowned in this deposit. That's not a burial. Apparently today, with practically 20 millimeters of rainfall, there were people drowning in these deposits, like this gentleman, which was dated to around 7,000 years ago. And this place, once you look into the deposits, which looks like this today, has looked into detail like a site in northern Kordofan or western Darfur as it looks today, and everything you see on this picture from the deposits to the bird bones we found in the deposits in this place. And that's how it looks in some other places where you found in such places high energy freshwater oysters, which you find today in the cataracts along the Nile Valley, but certainly no more anywhere in the Sahara or jaws of elephants or exotic minerals like this realistic volcanic rock, which indicate that there was a long range fluvial transport until a few thousand years ago. And you have probably the most ancient rock art at all, at least in northern Sudan, where you find these herds of rhinos, which are normally solitarily living animals, with peaceful people in between. So this is to me really some sort of impression from this early early paradise, which is depicted at this single rock art site near Wadi Hawa. And of course, archaeology, it's a nightmare. You have square miles large sites which have a cultural layer up to 1 meter in depth. That means it takes a few weeks just to excavate a few square yards, not to think of square mile. That means these are the largest prehistoric sites, which are even more expanded than any prehistoric site along the Nile Valley, but they will certainly never ever be excavated. And every single piece you find here consists of pottery or bone remains, because this is on top of a dune, whereas for physical reason there is not any other material to be expected. So we also found the largest and only big construction we ever found during the past 40 years, which is a fortress, a diameter 150 yards with walls up to 8 meters. And as we know today, it probably dates back 3,000 years from the Napatan period, but to the present day, its purpose is not well known. Why? To establish such a big fortress 100 kilometers away from the Nile, and probably, of course, to impress people coming from the south or controlling any traffic transport, maybe of gold and so on. But this puzzle hasn't been solved yet. So just one few what we can show from different regions in the Eastern Sahara. That's how the environment changed from a region with lots of lakes and temporary rivers, and then the paleo lakes dried out until people had to shift to places with near-surface groundwater where they could walk-in wells. So as a survival strategy to survive until even that groundwater fell too deep and they had to either to move or to die. So the most important example for the reconstruction of paleoclimatology are the Unyanga lakes, to the present day, in a hypercontinental position, very far from the nearest ocean coasts. And the first exploration happened in 1916 by some French military geographer. And that's in fact the state of the art we had when we took up the research in the late 90s, because the north of Chad was no more place to go there. But to go there is takes some time, and just to get the material and the vehicles there and doing the field work at the site so far already took almost 1 year of field work. And that's why I was lucky to do this field work, or the other were lucky not to take this venture. But going there is worth any trip. So you must imagine you cross the Sahara, which sometimes takes 1 week, 2 weeks, depending where you come, 3 weeks. And then you go without seeing a single piece of grass. And then you arrive at this spot and you advance in just 1 meter or 2 meters, and then you have the site of this inner of the largest lake surface in the Sahara of today, and where you have still islands in these lakes, and all kinds in the very rare moments where there's no wind, you have all kinds of reflections And there's even, and that's another specialty, you have freshwater lakes, which are a paradoxon to any arid place, because you know any fresh water gets salty within a few years or decades at best. And these are lakes which where you find today even toads and living mollusks, which are in a direct genetic line from the mollusks which are exposed in the old lake beds. And you also find fish, and these freshwater lakes occur only because of a unique natural mechanism, which consists that the former big lake, which once was, of course, much, much later, was dissected by encroaching dunes, which made several lake chambers, so to say, and the groundwater. And of course, this lake is 100% supported by fossil groundwater, by rainfall which fell in the early Holocene, and 100% against a measured evaporation of more than 6,000 millimeters a year, which makes it another natural extreme. And the groundwater which goes into this peripheral lake is transported through the dune bodies into the central salt lake, which works like a gigantic evaporation pump and keeps this mechanism going. And that's why you have fresh drinking water you can use in a place where it's not supposed to be there. There are other lakes in the western part, but they are all highly saline, and the most important of it is Lake Johan, which is the largest body of water in the Sahara because of its depth of 27 meters. It has a diameter of only 2 miles, but because of its depth, which is again fully 100% depending on fossil groundwater, and the evaporation on these lakes equals the consumption of a European town with 1 million inhabitants permanently. And all this tremendous loss of more than 6 meters of water column is completely recharged by fossil rainwater, and that makes it so exceptional. But by the way, you can subscribe to this magazine freely, and in the present edition there's also an article on it. And the most important thing for science is that when I went there for the first time in '99 with a small rubber boat and not even knowing the depths of the lake, and it got deeper and deeper and deeper, and then I took a gravity core. And what you can see here, that when I took the core out, you have had what we called a waft layering. That means you have one layer for summer, one layer for winter, one layer for summer, one layer for winter, etc. And that's the best you can have as a paleoclimatologist, because such sediments give very precise data and information on climate change down to a sub-annual chronological scale. And you see that the top of the core is completely undisturbed and consisting only of algae, which are still drizzling down while we are here together. The sedimentation goes on and provides a new record for the last years. And this was good enough for a science cover story. And to cut a long story short, the analysis of pollen data and several other data were clearly indicating that there was a very gradual desiccation of the Sahara during the past 6,000 years, from a fully developed savannah vegetation over some sort of Sahelian type vegetation to the present day, to some desert vegetation, until even this disappeared, and there was nothing left but some oasis flora around the lake. And this is in clear contrast to the assumption of my friend Peter, who was claiming that this aridification of the Sahara happened very quickly within decades. And the detailed analysis of this core showed that there's really not a single year missing in this record. And that's why we returned there in 2010 with some heavier equipment and working for a long time under quite high temperatures to extract the longest core, not only of the Sahara or even Africa, but probably on Earth, where we have 16 meters of the sub-annually laminated deposits, which I consider as some sort of Rosetta Stone for paleoclimatology of the Sahara. And There's lots of publications in the pipeline, so there's hardly any other comparable site on this. And of course, these lakes were up to 100 meters higher than today because there is former lake deposits on top of the surrounding table hills, which give information on the former extent, which, for example, you see here in Lake Eure was much bigger than what's left today. And apart from science, usually our counterparts in Africa, they are less interested in paleoclimate than in mineral deposits, or in that case, in an initiative I took 15 years ago to get these lakes listed as a World Heritage Site, and this is what's happened. That's why I got with my colleagues decorated as Knights of Chad by the Chadian president, and even all the local people and the local hierarchy are very happy because nobody, even most Chadians, have never heard about these lakes. Nobody ever went there, and now they are the first World Heritage natural site in one of Africa's largest country, and there's already lots of improvements for the daily life of the people available today. So a short example, because I've been mostly talking about climate, environmental change. I will also give one example from archaeology, and that's one site we call Sahara. It's a cave in the central Egyptian plateau where such kind of artifacts of knives were produced by the prehistoric people, real pieces of art, which later 500 to 1,000 years occur in the Nile Valley. And if you have such the former collection of these artifacts which were excavated even 100 years ago in the Nile Valley, and you put the samples, the artifacts from the Sahara over, and you see they're really fitting them completely, but only they were couple of 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, 1,500 years older. And that same applies to some sort of typical pottery with some black rims and so on, which also occurs hundreds of years earlier than the first time in the Nile Valley. And there's also a lot of other evidence on links even during the later period between that the last ecological niches remaining in what became more and more a desert, the desert as we know it today, with the Nile Valley, including, no time for that, but possible origins of hieroglyphic writing even deep in the Sudanese desert. So now you almost made it. I make a short time travel through the last 11,000 or 15,000 years. That's how it looked like, say, 15,000 years ago. The Eastern Sahara, you don't see a single prehistoric site. There was absolutely no occupation, or in 35 years we would have overlooked it, but there's really many reasons to believe that the entire site, this equals the size of Western Europe. It's more than 2 million square kilometers, not a single site, while all available, all known prehistoric sites are along the Nile Valley, of course, because of the Aswan rescue, Nubian salvation campaign. They are better studied here than here, but there's not a site anywhere outside until apparently some 11,000 years the Nile Valley became too overcrowded. At least that's one explanation, because there are graveyards where you still find arrowheads and individuals which were apparently killed by arrowheads by tribal fights and so on. So suddenly, apparently, the Nile Valley, which was receiving much less rainfall than during the later period, was no more a perfect place to live. And this changed relatively rapidly, not within decades or within generations, but say between 500 to 800 years, when monsoonal rain coming from the south went north from where it is today, changing. That was once a completely unoccupied subcontinent into a savannah. That means there was no more desert in the strict sense. It was certainly arid to semi-arid with rainfall below 150 millimeters, always against the evaporation of 6,000 millimeters. But you see that's the green Sahara. And what is clear, that you hardly have any site left along the Nile Valley, while all the occupation sites are in what is today the Egyptian Sahara, and you have a couple of sites in the northern Sudanese desert, Sahara, but not in the part which received most of the rainfall. And again, the best explanation is that it was just too humid, too dangerous, too unpleasant for daily living, that prehistoric people who certainly arrived from the south, moved northward, where they had these open savannas, which are good for grazing, for hunting, game, etc., and a much better place to live than along a temporary river infested by all kind of unpleasant animals. And this situation stayed there for around 2,300 years, when there was a development not only and even previously of pottery, which is maybe which is a sign of the so-called Neolithic revolution, which is probably, until maybe the electronic revolution recently, was the biggest step forward in mankind, because this is a sign of sedentary living with lots of implication, and later domestication of grains, and especially domestication of cattle, which is of pastoralism, which is a way of life which still is the most important one for the rural areas of sub-Saharan Africa. But anyway, people were living all around, and that's a phase where only in the north there was some influence for the introduction of goat and cattle, goat and sheep, while probably cattle was an autochthonous invention from the Green Sahara period. And this situation changed about 5,300 years BC, when you see that there was first of all a shift of settlement sites into the south, what is today the northern Sudanese desert. People were surviving only in ecological niches, be it in the plateau, in niches like on the Gilf-Gebir Plateau or in the Oasis Depression, but in the vast spaces of the Eastern Sahara, there was no more settlements. And especially what you see is that 3,500, you have hardly any settlement site left, in what is the western desert of Egypt today, and you have a complete corridor of settlement along the Nile Valley, and some remaining settlers further south in the Sahara. And you see that this was really the decisive date, 7,000 years, around 7,500 years ago, when there was really the onset of the desiccation of the Sahara, which went on until probably very recently. Another interesting subject is the importance of the desert to the pharaonic period, but this would be good for another talk, when there was the first trans-Saharan expedition sent by the pharaohs with a lot of most recent and unpublished discoveries during the past few years. So again, the whole picture, the Sahara once was at least 1/4 larger than it is today. So in spite of 9 million square kilometers, it was probably 12 million kilometers, so covering much more than 1/3 of the continent, a relatively sudden onset of the Green Sahara, a relatively stable period of 2,500 years, and then a very gradual southward retreat of the desert margin to the situation where it is today. And again, if you look to thousands of archaeological and geological radiocarbon dates, again you see in this graph, which is aligned from north to south, a relatively simultaneous onset of settlement. And then you had this period where what we call the formation period, where people did a big cultural and socio-economic steps, and then 5,300, that was the onset of the aridification of the Sahara. In the later period, only in ecological niches there was room for survival, or you had to move south. That means stay and die, or maybe develop some survival strategies for some generation, and then you have to move or die. And that's what people did during all this time. And again, this is maybe a synthesis of all these decades of field work, where again you see the north, the trend, the relatively simultaneous onset of settlement all over the Sahara, and the gradual desiccation of the desert. And that goes along with what we always called Egypt's desert roots, and where you have all kinds of desert traditions which made it into the pre-dynastic period and later even in the dynastic time. And this, by my friend and colleague Rudolf Cooper, was our guiding line of our research since late 1970s. And probably no more time to read all to this, but who wants to know better can stop the stream or so on. But essentially that's what I said again in a few lines. And now concerning the desert origins of the dynastic civilization, that was, I mean, the traditional view was always that the origins of Egypt, of the Egyptian civilization, all came from Southwest Asia and were introduced by some sort of a superior culture. But I think this notion is more and more given up, except by some very traditional Egyptologists. And there's lots of proof that there was really this biggest step into in human evolution from hunters and gatherers to sedentary people living more or less the way of life we still do today, with the invention of the biggest invention, which was pottery at the period, which provided for the preservation of food and other things. This was clearly happening completely independently from what was happening in the Levant, in Palestine, and so on. And the more and more evidence shows that there's many technological, cultural, socio-economic traditions which were invented in the West, what is today the Western Desert of Egypt, and which were introduced into the prehistoric and pharaonic cultures in the Nile Valley. And now again, unless you claim that the coincidence of the state of roughly 3,500 BC, when there was absolutely no more room, not even one niche, existing niche where you could survive in the desert, and this equals exactly the time, the origin of the Egyptian civilization, then you will probably see some climate impact on it, and maybe even a climate control, which doesn't work everywhere. So it does make a big difference if you're in Somalia and there used to be 300 millimeters rainfall, today is 200 millimeters of rainfall. That doesn't make that much. But when you're in a region where you had 150 millimeters and later you have none, this makes a big difference. And that's why we all firmly believe that this aridification of the Sahara, which was terminated 3,500, at the same time gave rise to the origin of the Nile Valley civilizations, not only in the Nile, but also not only in Egypt, but also in Sudan, in the Nubian civilization. And that's why we shorten up always. So Egypt is not only, at least, a gift of the Nile, as already Herodotus said, but at the same time a gift of the desert. And now I thank you for your enduring to this many slides, and after hope for a discussion, I hope you have a good way back.
Like them to sleep. Let's have a seat. My leg went to sleep. I'm not having a stroke or anything here. I think about an hour of thinking about that would be in order at this point. Okay, a quick, easy question from Jim Spalding. Why don't you helicopter into these places instead of grinding your way across an impossible surface?
Well, it's they too far away, and even the most modern Egyptian army helicopter, they could make it one way, but not back. On the other hand, theoretically, all the place where we live, where we do our research is a protected military area. That means getting a helicopter there, even for this, is impossible. And even very good US colleagues from Flagstaff, in spite of year-long waiting, they never got the permit just to take a research aircraft to fly over the Western Desert. So this is certainly no option. And if you have lots of time, then maybe army-type rescue mission could make it, but then you certainly would need to wait for weeks, and so far never ever in most of these places a helicopter has been to the present day.
Where have you been the last couple of days and why?
Where I've been to Chad a few days ago before just changing the plane for San Francisco. I've been in the capital of Chad. N'Djamena, the hottest African capital, we had temperature 45 degrees Celsius, and in the beginning rainy season that makes permanent sauna. And there the objective was to push forward another World Heritage project to work that hopefully next year, or at least 1 year later, the Ennedi Plateau will be elected as the second World Heritage Site of one of Africa's largest countries.
That sounds great. Say a little more. You showed us some of the stuff of that plateau. Well, it becomes a World Heritage Site. Does it then become a place that some of us can go and visit and see some of those incredible box canyons and monument valleys and rock art and the rest of it? What happens when it becomes a World Heritage Site?
Oh, sure. Well, there's, of course, very strictly guidelines for any World Heritage Site, and so all the host countries, because this is World Heritage and not just national heritage, so they are advised to follow it, and usually it's relatively easy to control the relatively few visitors who will go there during the next years and decades, provided that the security situation remains stable, because in contrast to practically all of history, northern Chad now is the only tranquil, quiet island within the Sahara, while all the other 10 Saharan states are practically no more place to go, at least not into the desert, unless you want to do some adventure travel.
So are other scientists following your path here? And one of the questions had to do is, why is Germany so particularly interested in this part of the world? And you're a German scientist operating what looks like a German scientific tradition. And have forged the way into some amazing areas and amazing kinds of discovery. Are other scientists following now and pursuing these paths of research?
Well, it's getting more and more difficult to find students who are ready to go into the field for months without an extreme. It's because it's extreme group conditioned. You're like on a space shuttle. There's no way to have a beer one day. You're practically in the night. You can take your sleeping bag and go away from the camp for a couple of 100 meters. We are living on 5 liters a day, 1 gallon a day, which we hardly use except when it really gets hot. Everything included. In the night it's very cold, daytime it's very hot. You can't take a shower for months. You are separated from your family or friends for months. So fewer and fewer students are ready to take this just to do the research. So what we're still, we are sort of outdying species of this type of research. We have to wait for some Mars-type robots who will take the follow-up. And usually it's still sometimes possible to find students who go along once to write the diploma thesis or the PhD and so on, but right after they switch over to remote sensing, lab work, etc. So,
Stefan, this is shocking.
It's shocking, yes.
The younger generation of explorers are wusses.
Yes. You say so.
Oh, I would expect you make this adventure look so tough and incredible that you, if anybody, would be attracting people who would be coming up after talks like this saying, okay, I'm changing my life. I want to go to the hardest, most exciting places in the world where really original discoveries can be made. You don't have a lot of people being inspired to go off and do that through this?
No, I have a long, long list of so-called amateurs, of laymen, of people, I mean, rock art, hunters or interested in rock art, or adventurers and so on, if I retired generals, doctors. So I have a long, long, long list of people with just one call, one email, and I can take along 50 on one trip. The problem is this is not covered by the German Research Council, and I need to take scientists or students to do this kind of research. And of course, you need some training. And that's a problem. So, I mean, there's lots of highly enthusiastic people who would pay even a lot just to follow it, because we're really going to this last unexplored, little explored places which you can't order with some tour operator. But unfortunately, we need specialists, and they are difficult enough to get, and also it's all you need. Normally, it's impossible to find to get a good team, because first of all, most important is you have to have a team which gets along for a specific time of a period of time in an extreme group condition. Of course, you need a very good field researcher. Then you need at the same time, say, a good writer who puts it all, does the paperwork. Then you need one who knows about lab analysis, which is very important. And then you need one who does cooking, who can change cars, who can solve mechanical problems, etc., etc. And this list is very difficult to complete. And so even in the good old days, it was difficult to get some teams which you could get along. Because, well, if you have one or two in the team who hate to do it, and you have, they are around for the next 2 months, you can send them home. That's really the worst what can happen. And
so the training part sounds like, in a way, the sort of hardest field. What training do you really want in the scientists that you would take into a place like this? What background do they need to have? What kinds of backgrounds do they need to have to be useful?
No, of course, it's mostly a background in geological fieldwork, in archaeological excavations, in botanical research, and so on. Of course, this is the profile, but at the same time, one has to be ready to take these conditions, and I would say most of, at least the German soldiers, would not be ready to do this way of life for an extended period of time. So it's really a big problem apart from academic specifications of this kind of field research. Well,
with YouTube and extreme sports and sort of the things that people show off, this is more interesting than going to Mars. In fact, it's pretty similar to going to Mars, except you can actually get there. And I'm astonished there isn't more attraction for highly skilled, highly trained, highly courageous, and highly cooperative people to come and find their way onto these expeditions. So get with it, people. Question, in your 40 years of exploring the deep Sahara, have you ever visited the same location during the same time of year and found differences? Or is it the main event that nothing changes? Oh, it changes. I mean, it's a highly dynamic environment, all deserts. And even if you go to a specific location during different time of the day, in the morning, at midday, in the evening, you see different things because of the light which comes from different angles. Sometimes you go in the morning, you find nothing but fish remains. In midday, you find plenty of meteorites, and in the evening, you find plenty of pottery fragments all around, just depending on the light which gets there. And of course, because of the ever-shifting sands, sometimes places are exposed which are covered the next day, and sometimes covered for 1,000 years. Others which move forward. For example, we once found a dinosaur skeleton in the windward direction of this big crescentic Balkan dunes.
when I tried, came with some specialists 5 years later, this 20-meter high Barkhan dunes weighing 200,000 tons was over it. So it would need you have to wait a couple of 100 years until it moves by. And so it's not just a matter of returning there, but you always find new things and some things you overlooked and so on. And
the lesson there is never discover something in front of a Barkhan dune. Discover things that are being revealed by the dune that's moving on.
Both, for example, we found of one of the pioneer explorers, Ralph Becknott, who I still got to know, who died almost 30 years ago. And we found, for example, some of his camps in 1930 with a bottle of whiskey, with a piece of Times, a newspaper. And this was covered by this gigantic dune. And 50, 60 years later, we found the campsite. And so we could calculate the speed of the dune advancement.
Really. And the newspaper was readable.
It was readable. It's a very dry because unless in the tropical realm, so everything it's dry. There's no animals, not even termites who could eat it. So usually what you find there, it stays like it is, and until the erosion by the wind removes it completely.
I imagine the whiskey bottle looked kind of
Jars,
good at that point. Yeah, we should have kept ours. So the desert is telling this long-term story of that you've dissected in great detail, and there's a flux, and we see similar things in the stories of the ice coming and going in the north, and here the rains coming and going in North Africa. What's your sense of, in that sort of long oscillation, how it plays out over the next 10,000 years to come up with a round number that we like a lot?
Well, exactly. I mean, that's not politically correct, what I'm going to answer to your question. I like it. Well, generally, most paleoclimatologists agree that the past climate history was mostly controlled by astronomical factors. That means the so-called Milankovitch curves and the insulation on what is today Northern Africa during the preceding 2.5 million years, when there was one humid phase more or less every 100,000 years. That was quite a regular cycle, of course, with some changes. And for example, the preceding wet phase, the so-called Eemian or marine isotopic H5, that was probably much more important than the last, the early Holocene green Sahara, and it was much longer. But this was this trend. And so normally, I would say, well, the last glacial maximum happened some 25,000 years ago. That means we would have to wait for the next period of a green Sahara, regreening of the Sahara, some 60,000 years. This would be the natural cycle. Now, since the late 1980s, I found in these remote places where there is no human use, not even by Bedouins or by their camels or goats, there is a clear trend for a very slow onset of a sort of regreening at the southern margin of what is today the desert boundary. A regreening, that means some grasses, there's increasing rainfall, which produces more grassland, which then attracts camel people who came first time in generations much further north, and then some birds arrive, mice arrive, snakes arrive. We even see now ostrich and so on, and the gazelles are multiplying. So there's really a clear trend. Of course, you can only see it once you go to places which are without any, which are not used for grazing or not on. So that's what everybody's talking about, the encroachment of the desert. This is only valid around the big cities. And now imagine, for example, Darfur. It had a population of 1 million inhabitants in the 1950s. now we are approaching 10 million within 60 years. And of course, once you're approaching the big cities, I mean, that's all desert land. There's no more trees, there's nothing. But once you go to places which is far away, there's an opposite trend. And so I get insulted as some sort of climate skeptic because I say there's always winners and losers, and which is very bad for the Bangladeshi, maybe good to the sub-Saharan Sahelian zone, or even for the old desert zone of the old world desert, which reaches from the Atlantic into central China. And this is, I would say, if this continues, it's a positive trend. But again, this doesn't mean everybody has to buy a high-powered vehicle just to speed up the process. But the trend seems to be there, and well, it's now for 25 years that it can't be denied. And there's more and more remote sensing studies and also other arguments which now follow this early suggestion.
So it's been going on 25 years, and you showed me a photograph earlier in the green room. You showed me a photograph of a piece of desert which would be the most boring place on Mars. It's flat, nothing. And then another year, the same place where it's absolutely verdant with, it looks like flowers, with forbs, with grass, with shrub-like stuff and so on. People did not seed that. So that suggests to me that in that totally desiccated desert, there was a seed bank of plant seeds just waiting patiently for a bit of rain. Is that the case? How old are those seeds, do you suppose? How long do they have to wait?
They can apparently wait hundreds of years. And of course, sometimes, normally, the dominating winds, 95% are the trade winds coming from the north. But there, of course, some rare southerly winds, which then, even to the present day, can bring seeds far into the desert. And then it just needs some local rainfall. And you have, within days and weeks, you have a coverage. And this doesn't apply only to the eastern Sahara. My Sahrawi friends from the western part of the Sahara, my Chadian friends in north, my Sudanese friends, I mean, everybody who goes there is telling the same story. They can't believe it. Every year they say, it has never been that green. The next they say, it has never been that green. But of course, only there where there's hardly any human being once it's used, and you just you would have to make a fence around it, and you would get a regreening belt, which is being done these days of trying this, make this green wall on the southern border of the Sahara. It's a big project which already has started quite well, which one day shall make a fenced area from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, and to show and to first to prevent wind encroachment, sand encroachment, but also to make a natural green wall against the desert. And this is, if this trend continues, it's certainly
this is somebody's fantasy, or is this a scheme that various nations across that part of Africa are collaborating on?
It's a scheme. Theoretically, all sub-Saharan states are collaborating. Of course, sometimes they have other problems, and not talking about the increasing insecurity in the Sahara. It has never been so difficult to do fieldwork in the Sahara like today. That means our paradise of fools, where we could do what we like for decades. This is gone probably forever. And because nobody will take away the small arms, nobody will take away the GPS and the landmines and so on. So this is there to be almost forever, I'm afraid. And but this scheme is officially convened.
This grand project of greening that band of Africa, there's a science fiction book called Dune by Frank Herbert that comes to mind, of a desert people, taking generations to with a grand vision of how they can revitalize, in that case, their planet, in this case, an entire area of an amazing continent. Anyway, this is an extraordinary vision. And it, apart from helping with this kind of exploration, one then wants to wonder, are there ways to help that scheme, to help the regreening of that part of long ungreen Africa, to maybe help with restoring not only the plant life, but the biodiversity that presumably goes with that plant life if it's allowed to. Is that also a part of this fantasy?
It sure is. So I think that really the major problem, again, political incorrect, is the exponential population growth in sub-Saharan Africa. I think with a stable population, say that of the 1950s, I think there would already be a very positive trend recognized by all the people living there. But of course, this is a very sensitive subject in all religions, and which is ignored. But in the fact, many problems from Darfur to anywhere, they're all related to this for the lack of natural resources compared to the ever increasing population everywhere, and that's the major problem, which is. There's no way for any solution in the next time ahead, I'm afraid.
Well, back to exploration. Irina asks, you've found so much. Is there anything you're looking forward to in this region that you want to explore, that you want to find, that you think are important discoveries, kinds of discoveries yet to be made? What's still out there?
Oh, sure, uncountable. I mean, there's still for generations of field research. I mean, for example, the northern part of Chad is, as I think I mentioned, is as unknown as southwestern Egypt. This plateau was 120 years ago. I mean, there's still a big, 100 years ago, only 100 years ago, it was discovered only later, means 90 years ago. Even the same situation is in northern Chad, where you still have unhidden treasures. I mean, it's no way not to find anything if you know what you're looking for in the Sahara. Yes, there's some people who go there, they said, oh, what the archaeologists are telling about all these artifacts. We spent there months, we never found anything. Once you know a bit and you only see what you know. Once you know it, for example, for years we didn't find fish bones, these parts of this Nile perch, for example. Once we knew to recognize them, we found them everywhere. Same applies to meteorites, to pottery, to artifacts, to many other things, microliths, tiny things. That means no matter where your car breaks down or you have to change the tire, you get out and you find something. So even sometimes in the night when you're always looking, and I hate to sleep right at the campsite because someone's snoring, some parts are moving and so on. So always in the night I take my sleeping bag and my sack and go a couple of 100 meters away from the camp upwind. And so finally I find a site. I find a place to put my mattress and my sleeping bag, and in the night I wake up and I look to my right looking for my torch. What do I have in hand? Aeolian hand aches, which can be 500,000 years ago. I look at the other side. Again, I don't find my torch. I have another Aeolian hand aches. And the next morning I look around. The hand aches are really concentrated at this specific site where it's protected from the wind by some sort of Inselberg, by some rock obstacle. That means some prehistoric hunters and gatherers 500, 400, 300,000 years ago had the same problem of looking for a campsite in the night where they didn't get the heavy chill factor. And so it's still unbelievable much to find. Biggest part of the rock art, for example, in the Jebel Aounat, in this triple junction between Libya and Egypt and Sudan, which we're also trying to get to make it into a transboundary national park, was discovered only during the past 10 years. I mean, and many other places, so there's still unlimited scope for discoveries in these places. And I couldn't touch upon these ancient pharaonic trails into the Sahara, which are highly interesting subjects. Is first trans-Saharan highways, because during Pharaonic Old and Middle Empire, there were no camels, of course. So any expeditions into what was already a full developed desert demanded highly logistic skills and so on, because you had to transport your water with donkeys, where you needed hundreds of donkeys just to get the water, which you then could use as sort of payload and so on. And there's lots of interesting discoveries, and I think that these expeditions which were sent by the pharaohs into the desert, where we also already found some hieroglyphic inscriptions in a line, that they were heading for the NAD Plateau and for the Unyanga Lakes, which during the earlier time must have been really supra-regional importance. So certainly the pharaohs all heard about it and wanted to get everything which a blooming African environment could provide.
Okay, so here these guys are on the Nile. They're a long way from those lakes. And they're heading out in that direction looking for the lakes, freshwater lakes full of fish and stuff. But it's a long way off. So is it stories that they're hearing that there's these lakes out there? Is it the occasional individual who's somehow getting across and saying there's lakes where I just was? How would they know about something that far away that they would do expeditions toward it?
It's a very good question, because, of course, the Egyptians traditionally, to the present day, are very, very much afraid of the desert. Everything bad always comes from the desert. Today, either be it the locusts, or be it sandstorms, or be it bandits, or later the Libyans. So we had some Egyptian colleagues with us, because the archaeologists always have to take a sort of inspector with them. And when he came with us, one of us for 35 years, he was never leaving the car. Because all his colleagues said nobody ever returned alive from the Gilf Kebir. I mean, we spent 1 or 2 months in the desert. When we returned and we hit the first tracks and then we hit the first paved road, he went out praying for 1 hour because it was a new life. That means that's a typical standard. And now imagine in the past, probably there was the same story, that most of the Nile dwellers, everything bad came from the desert. Nobody was the land of the dead, and in many, many hieroglyphic writings it's described of the place where you wouldn't find any good. But then to send expeditions there, long missions which took months into a direction, probably were only possible with some support, with some local knowledge, by maybe the last tough guys who remained anyway, anyhow, in this remote desert, maybe some very, very last ecological niches. And they probably were used as guides. We never had any guides, because in the Eastern Sahara there are no guides available, because all people left 5,000 years ago. And so we always had to be our guides. But in most other parts of the Sahara, of course,
there used to be guides, but it was 5,000 years ago. Yeah.
But at that time, you didn't need any guides, because it was a lush savannah. So that's another. But anyway, and so probably they depended on some local knowledge from some tough guys who led them where they met them, these people coming from sub-Saharan Africa, exchanging their goods and so on.
One final story. Tell me about the Persian army that headed into the desert.
Well, that's another of the mysteries of the Libyan desert. After Alexander, there was a Persian general called Cambyses or Cambyses.
This is when now? What century are we in?
That was some 500 BC.
Okay.
And what is known, that he went along down the Nile Valley, went west, apparently, and there's the last record that he reached
presumably there's Egyptians all along the way. You'll be sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
That's all right. We can handle. We're Persians. We know
but
about
at least
deserts,
he already was disposing of camels, and so that was a big advantage. And so he probably made it into the new valley in the Oasis Depression west of the Nile, and he was heading for the Siwa, which was the site of Alexander's oracle, and so on, which was a tricky thing. A friend of mine, Klaus Kuhlmann, who excavated for years, but another story.
That's hundreds of miles to the northwest.
Across to the northwest through the Great Sand Sea of Egypt, which consists of this 1,000 kilometers long longitudinal dunes up to 100 meters high, which are even very difficult to cross by camels. That means because they have steep angles and so on. Anyway, he never showed up in Siwa, but he left the Oasis Depression. So according to different sources, which range from 5,000 to 50,000, 2000. He got drowned by the sand somewhere, hit by some sandstorm, but there's some hints on this Persian armies consisting of old stone cairns, which we found, some Persian pottery in some sites, but that's all what is known. And even to penetrate through tens of meters of sand is, even with modern means, a very difficult task. So still way for
an unsolved
exploration.
Mystery. It's your job to find out what happened to that army. Thank you so much.